The Frankly Speaking Roof Cam, brought to you by Boss Security in Horseheads. Contact them today for all your business and home security needs. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acomb. We're broadcasting from the Hesselson studio and in that Zoom studio this morning. Saritha, thanks so much for being on the program.
Of course. Thank you, Frank.
Well, first of all, congratulations on deciding to run. Why did you decide to run?
Listen, we've got to make New York safer. I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years. I prosecuted terrorists and narco-terrorists, and then I was chief of staff of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and I was nominated to be a federal judge. So my whole focus for my whole career has been public safety. And public safety in New York has totally deteriorated in the last 7 years, since 2019 when Letitia James became Attorney General. And the reason is simple. Look at the numbers and look at how people feel. Crime in New York is up 26%. Drug deaths are up 63%. Homelessness is up 38%. And you don't need me to tell you those numbers, because if you're in New York today, you see it all around you. There are repeat offenders in every county in the state that are out on the streets hurting people, and they shouldn't be there. We are seeing severely mentally ill people on drugs suffering from addiction, who we can take care of, but we're not taking care of them. And we see that this is devastating communities, making people feel less safe. It's making things more expensive. There's a lot of theft from stores, theft of cars that raises our prices. And people feel like, you know what, the quality of life in New York just isn't what it used to be, and they're leaving.
And you're right, and even businesses not coming to us, because like you mentioned with the theft, how many missed opportunities have we talked about economically where businesses wouldn't touch New York with a 5-foot pole?
Yeah, it's a real problem, and that's large businesses, it's small businesses too. You know, a couple of months ago, I was in Watkins Glen. I was walking down Main Street. I was talking to shop owners, and one of the shop owners, the wonderful woman who owns a chocolate store, was telling me about how, you know, they're seeing people come in and steal from their store and they leave. And what's actually happening in some of these small towns is we're actually importing crime because everyone knows now in New York you can commit a crime and there's no consequences. So people come in sometimes from out of state, sometimes from the big cities to the small towns. They come in on the interstate or that throughway. They they steal from people and businesses because they know even if they're caught, they'll get released in an hour and they can go on their way. And it's hurting these small businesses. What are they supposed to do? You know, if someone steals, either the business has to take the hit. It's a family business. That means the family is taking the hit. Or it gets passed on to the customers through prices, and customers in a small town are paying higher prices. Either way, it is innocent, hardworking New Yorkers who are paying the cost of crime.
You're spot on, because when bail reform first hit, and as you allude to, I think there was some people in our area a little naive, thinking, well, this isn't going to affect smaller towns, smaller cities. Boy, were those people wrong, because it is all of New York State at this point.
It is all of New York State, and I can tell you, listen, I have just finished a 1,700-mile tour around New York State, driving through a number of different counties. There's 62 counties in the state. We've been to almost all of them. And you know, we will have visited every county before the end of this race. And I can tell you, I talk to voters every county, and I hear the same concerns. It's not just a city problem. It's a problem in the rural areas. It's a problem in suburban areas. It's repeat offenders on the streets, drug deaths devastating communities, homelessness, mental illness. This sense that, you know, there's all these issues we used to take care of. But we don't anymore. For some reason, in 2019, we stopped. Well, that reason is because we got a weak person as Attorney General. She's not a prosecutor. She's a politician. She doesn't believe in supporting law enforcement. She doesn't believe in prosecuting crime. She doesn't actually make sure that our homeless shelter nonprofits are doing their job of taking care of the homeless. And we got weak laws like bail reform. And the combination of those things has made it so that since 2019, crime has gone up. That's a real shame. The good news is we can fix it.
And I was talking to the sheriff recently, and when you talk about the budget, the New York State budget every year, it's almost terrifying to see what new rules are going to put in that coddle the criminals and tie the hand of law enforcement. And we saw it again with the most recent New York State budget.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing about the budget is that we keep seeing this more and more spending, right? And the spending doesn't actually get us results. You need somebody to hold people accountable for that. The person who's supposed to hold others accountable in New York State is the Attorney General.
Right.
The reality is, if we prosecuted crime and we prosecuted fraud, we would get more than $1 billion back into New York State taxpayers' hands. $1 billion a year. Because just from crime and fraud, we lose way more than that. I'm being conservative in my estimate there.
Right.
The reality is, because we're not doing the job, we're also losing a ton of money, and that's a shame.
And you look at your background, and it's an amazing background. And then you see someone like Letitia James, your opponent, who has to use our taxpayer money to use outside counsel I don't understand this process. Could you explain that to me? How this is almost justified?
It's not justified. I mean, the reality is that the Attorney General's office is basically one of the largest law firms in New York. It's got 700 assistant attorneys general, and it's the second largest Attorney General's office in the country, behind California. You have the resources to do the work.
Right.
There's really no justification for outsourcing millions of dollars of work to private law firms when you have the people and the expertise to do it yourself. One of the most egregious examples is one where they hired a former U.S. Solicitor General to argue a case that personally affected Letitia James when, we have a talented former U.S. Solicitor General currently on the state's payroll in the AG's office. There's no justification for that. The AG's office has gotten away with wasting money for years.
Right.
And in a manner that just serves personal interests and personal vendettas of the AG,
right,
instead of actually serving New Yorkers.
And it's also interesting when you talk about Letitia James, where you start to look at the legal defense fund that she has. I mean, I don't want to just talk about your opponent. I want to talk about you. But when these things add up, it paints, I think, a very clear picture of who she is.
Yeah, listen, like I said, right now what we have in the AG's office is a politician focused on personal vendettas, personal interests.
Right.
That's not me. I'm a law enforcement professional. I was a prosecutor for 12 years. My whole focus is safety. I'm doing this because I have 4 kids. I live in the city. We have 2 sets of twins. And we want to make sure they grow up in a safe city, in a safe state. And that's what you really should have. Every New Yorker deserves to have an attorney general who's going to wake up every morning thinking, how can I make New York safer today?
Right. Instead of furthering her political career like we see with Letitia James. But moving on from that, I know that you had mentioned you traveled extensively throughout the state, and you've been holding these events with law enforcement roundtables. And we can talk about the city here in a moment, but what are you hearing from essentially the boots on the ground, from the people on the ground?
Yeah, you know what? These have been incredible opportunities to talk with law enforcement. So when we go county by county, we host these law enforcement roundtables. The sheriff, the DAs, sometimes the public defenders come, corrections officers, state troopers, police chiefs, really everyone. We call everyone together, and they're great forums to just really, it's an opportunity for me to listen, to hear what is going on the ground in each of these counties. I'll tell you what the reaction has been. First, people say, it's great that you're doing this. The actual Attorney General doesn't do this, but it's great because we need our chief law enforcement officer of the state to actually be in touch with law enforcement at all levels and understand what's going on the ground. And second, what the feedback I'm getting is that they don't feel supported. There are places in the state where they've asked for the AG's office's help, and the AG's office has declined. There are places in the state where they just feel like, listen, we have an AG right now who's more interested in investigating cops than criminals.
Exactly.
That's the problem, right? That affects how people are empowered to enforce the law, whether they're empowered to enforce the law. And as I said before, with bail reform and the prosecution policies, we just have created this culture of criminality in New York, a culture of lawlessness, where people know they can commit a crime and they'll get away with it. And it's affecting everyone. But all of this, it's really disappointing. The thing that gives me hope is that people know we can turn it around.
Right.
It is not too late. And it wasn't that long ago that we had law and order in New York. Before Tish James, we had law and order in New York. We just need to do things the right way, the common sense way. Support law enforcement, enforce the laws. Do it ethically and lawfully and with compassion, but do it. And that's how we protect everyone.
It's interesting you say that about seems more focused on investigating police officers, because every time there is an investigation, even locally, you see that they investigate and the police officer completely vindicated, everything's fine. Their press release still writes it from a negative point where they're still almost acting as if they want to find something wrong. And that's not a one-off. I've seen that numerous times.
No, that's their policy. The way that they approach everything is anti-law enforcement. That's exactly right. The language they use is say, well, we can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't commit misconduct, not that, hey, this guy's cleared, he did his job.
Exactly.
You know? And what law enforcement wants is a law enforcement leader. I asked one of the sheriffs I met with, I asked him, what is the one thing the AG's office can do to make your lives better? And he said, honestly, just knowing we have someone who has our back will make all the difference.
Yeah. Just morale. I mean, the way, God bless anybody that gets into law enforcement in New York State at this point. Because if it's not the media, you've got the Attorney General, you've got so many that don't have your backs when the going gets tough. Look at the Cooler cop case in New York City.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And here's the thing about the way it is now, it's not just that the person in that position doesn't support law enforcement. It's anti-law enforcement bias.
Right.
We're not supposed to have any kind of bias in our legal system. You shouldn't want to just nail a cop because he's a cop. But that's the kind of person we have now. That's not how the American justice system is supposed to work. Everyone is equal under the law. Right. That's the principle. That's the principle etched on our Supreme Court of the United States, and that's what we should follow. We don't play politics with public safety. Right. We treat everyone evenly, fairly, and in an open-minded way.
I saw recently that you spoke out, and this is something we talk about on the program a lot, but these recent attacks on houses of worship, and this is more in the city, but unfortunately, like everything else that starts in the city, starts to make its way upstate. Could you talk a little bit about your position? Obviously, you're against attacks on house of worship, but the fact that this is becoming such a prevalent thing and a prominent thing.
Listen, since the founding of our country and since the writing of the First Amendment, right. We have protected the free exercise of religion in the United States. It's an incredibly important right. It's an incredibly important right that needs to be protected by every attorney general. And frankly, shouldn't be political. It's not political. Even in New York state law, for years, on the books, we've had a law that allows one to establish safe buffer zones around houses of worship. That law already existed, a 300-foot buffer zone around houses of worship. Now the state legislature just passed a second law that is basically the same thing with a little bit, but again, here's the problem. The problem is not that we don't have legal authority. The problem is that we don't have someone to enforce that legal authority. The Attorney General, under New York Civil Rights Law 79M, has the power to create safe buffer zones. She has had that power for years, and she has not done it for houses of worship. She's done it for other buildings, but she hasn't done it for synagogues and churches and mosques and temples, and we need to. I will. It shouldn't be controversial. Listen, if there's a political controversy happening and folks want to protest, they can protest at a distance. It's not an infringement of free speech to protest by backing up a few steps. But just as important as free speech is free exercise of religion is also important. They are both First Amendment rights. And an Attorney General's duty is to protect everyone's rights, regardless of race, religion, or politics.
I also find it interesting because we're on this topic. If you recall, about a year ago, you had Governor Hochul wanting to ban masks, and nothing ever came from it because we had the horrible anti-Semitic attacks that were happening in New York City with the people wearing the masks. Then you fast forward, and when do they actually ban masks? When it affects law enforcement.
I mean, this is another example of the politicization of this issue. Are masks good? Are masks bad? Right. Well, it depends on who you're talking about. That's not how this is supposed to work. Right. Everyone is equal under the law. The real problem we have there is that we have people committing acts of violence on the street that aren't being held accountable for it. The reality is, if you don't have a DA who's dismissing charges just because he happens to agree with the politics of the protesters, but who's actually enforcing the law regardless of those politics, then you don't even have to worry about the mask. The person's going to get arrested. They're going to have a mugshot. It's not going to involve a mask,
Right.
right? The controversies that we are talking about now are really an outgrowth of the fact that we stopped enforcing the law for political reasons. And that's what the problem is. We don't need a politician as Attorney General.
Right.
We need a law enforcement professional who's going to create that baseline of safety that everyone can enjoy and everyone can operate in so that you can debate the politics in another forum.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about upstate already during this interview, but you said you're in the city, and I'm someone who reads the New York Post, and that's terrifying. And I don't say that to joke, but my goodness, what is happening in the city? Could you tell us a little bit about your experience there in the city itself?
Yeah, listen, in the city, you're right. What happens in the city often then it travels across the state, and so it is a concern. It also is important. The other thing that it might be of interest for folks to know what's in the city is because it affects how people vote here. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to think, well, people in the city are always going to vote one way. Not this year. Not because of what's happening in the city. You know, just this week we had a 13th person, 13th New Yorker, innocent New Yorker, thrown onto the subway tracks while he was just waiting for the train.
Horrible.
That shouldn't happen.
No.
That number should be 0 in New York.
Yeah, of course.
But because we have criminals on the streets and severely mentally ill on the streets and homeless on the streets and drug addicts addicted folks on the streets, you know, we have this volatility, right? Random acts of violence aren't so random anymore.
Right.
And that's scaring people. It's why people feel worried about walking down the street at night or taking the subway any time of the day, because they're seeing that. And I've seen that. You know, I used to take the subway with my kids, with my family.
Sure.
We've seen that ourselves. You know, every time you go into the train, there's someone who's not following the law, and it's an issue. But again, it's a fixable problem.
Right.
It didn't always used to be this way. You know, we know how to enforce the laws, enforcing even simple laws like fare evasion, for example. The people who are robbing and assaulting and groping others and throwing them on the tracks in the subway, they don't pay the fare. So if you enforce fare evasion, then you can stop them at the gates. In fact, there's video of just this last attacker crawling under the turnstiles before he pushes this guy on the tracks. That was a preventable crime. If I'm Attorney General, I make a transit crime strike force on day one. We make sure we enforce the fare evasion laws, which the DAs are currently refusing to do in New York City. And here's the added bonus. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to enforce those laws. We're going to take repeat and violent offenders out of the subway. That's going to make the subway safer. It's also going to make it so that we recover all the money we lose in fare evasion every year, which is $1 billion. We lose $1 billion in fare evasion every year. Think about what we can do if we reinvest that money into our state, into services for people, into drug treatment and mental health treatment, so that we're actually helping the people, getting them off the streets, instead of putting others at risk.
And you mentioned this repeat offender, and I know this is kind of a common thread throughout our whole conversation, but when you see some of the rap sheets, so to speak, of people that have been just released, as you had mentioned, sometimes before the ink is dry on their paperwork, how can anybody, I don't care what political party you're in, look at that and say this is the way that you run a system of laws? It makes absolutely no sense to me.
It doesn't make sense. And this is why we're going to win this election, because we have gotten to a point in New York where it doesn't make sense, and people across the political spectrum agree that it doesn't make sense. You know, the last time I was in arraignment court as a federal prosecutor, I remembered we had a guy come in, he had 27 priors, and he was, for some reason, out on probation and had skipped a probation appointment. So the NYPD went out looking for him. They found him in an apartment across the street from a middle school, selling heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl, and with the loaded. And then when he came into the state, he got 6 months and was released again. So they brought him to federal court and asked if I could do anything about it. I mean, most people agree that person shouldn't be across the street from a middle school. But this is the New York we're living in. That's one story. You know, I was out in Western New York in Allegheny County. The sheriff was telling me that he caught someone who stole 13 cars in 21 days. And then when he was caught, the guy said, "I'll just give me my ticket and I'll be on my way." Because that's what happens in New York, and the criminals know it. We've gone too far. We way overcorrected, and we need to go back to common sense.
just before we go, and we've kind of covered it all during our interview, but what would you say is your ultimate goals, plural, if you are victorious come Election Day in November?
We're going to do three things. We're going to reduce crime, we're going to reduce homelessness, and we're going to reduce fraud. And when we do that, it'll make New York safer and less expensive.
Great. All right. How do we find out more? And of course, how can we help?
Visit my website, Saritha, Saritha, Saritha4newyork.com, all spelled out. Follow me on social media, repost me, and contribute to our campaign. Most importantly, just spread the word. Make sure people know my name. Mm-hmm. I'm Saritha. I'm a law enforcement professional. I'm running to bring professionalism, and I'll focus on public safety back to the New York Attorney General's office.
Great. Well, best of luck. Thanks for giving us so much time this morning. I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking after this.